Hey everyone, welcome to another video in this series about creating a chat app in Flutter the right way. And in this video, we'll be looking at creating our message thread screen, or that screen that we'll use to send messages between clients or users. So we'll jump right into it. And if it is your first time here, please consider watching the other videos so that you might get up to speed with what is happening. And also consider subscribing, liking the video. So here inside of our lib folder, what we want to do is go right ahead and start by creating the navigation from our home screen, or whenever we select a message, to open that message in the message thread screen. So I'm just going to go ahead inside my UI folder, pages, home, and I'm going to create a home router class, and this will be responsible for handling the routing action. So I'll go ahead. First, I'll create the interface or the contract, the abstract class. Go ahead and import those. And as you can see, this abstract class or the router will have one method which accepts the build context, the user, which in this case will be the receiver of the message or the person that you're sending the message to, and also me, which is the person from which the message is coming. So if we should go ahead and create our home router that implements this iHome router abstract class. So here we have our home router class, which accepts for its dependency a function, and this function will be responsible for showing the message thread screen, which in turn will compose all the necessary dependencies for that screen, and then will show that screen, which we will implement here in this function by simply pushing at the correct navigator route. So we use our navigator to push a material route and pass in the show message thread callback function and pass in the necessary dependencies for that screen. So this is our router. So alongside of our router, we need also to go ahead and where we have states management, let us create a message thread folder, and inside that folder I'm going to create a message thread qubit. And all that my message thread qubit is doing is to accept the chat view model as its dependence. Then I'm going to initialize that with an empty list, and I have one method here which is messages, which will get all the messages from the database using the view model and then emit those messages to render inside of our UI. So now that we have our qubit and our router, we can go ahead inside of our composition root and compose our message thread screen. So now we have created our method to compose our message thread screen, which accepts the receiver and also the chat ID. And for its dependencies, we have the chat view model, which uses the data source. We have our message thread qubit. We have our receipt service here. And we also have the receipt block, which uses the receipt service. and we simply compose a multi-block provider with the message thread qubit and the receive block, which is basically what we have been doing so far in the composition route with our home UI and also our onboarding UI. And as you can see, I have my message thread screen here, which I have not yet implemented, which will accept all these dependencies. And the message thread will share the same qubit as the home screen or the chat screen. So I need to go ahead and make this chat's qubit here global. So I'm just going to remove this from here. I'm going to make it private also. Then I'm going to go to the top, make it static. I will create the view model here. Which will be the chat's view model. And then let's instantiate our chat's qubit. So now we have made that global, so we have access to that inside of our home screen here and also inside of our message thread screen. We also need our home screen here, our home screen, to accept the home router. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that there, home router. Just going to call that router. Then inside of our composition route, we need to instantiate that router, home router. And for our show message thread callback, we will say compose message thread UI. So now we can go ahead and pass that router here inside of our home constructor. So now for our message thread, this is the UI. We can go to UI, pages, I'm going to create another folder. And there I'll create my message thread UI, which will be a stateful widget. And then for its dependencies, we will add the user, which is the receiver, also the sender, the chat ID, the message block, the notification block, the chat's qubit, and then we'll just pass those into our constructor along with the chat ID. So now we have that set up. We can just go ahead and import that here. And now inside of our home, we can call the UI whenever the user taps a chat. So let us go to chats. Then we'll find the list item, the chat item. And here we'll set up our onClick method. But first, let us pass in those dependencies. And in this case, I want the home router here. So now we have access to that router. We can set up here our gesture detector to detect a chat, a click rather, on each list item. So for its child, let's go ahead and move that chat item. Then on tap, let's go ahead and say whenever we tap the chat, we can await this widget and get the router and see on show message thread. We pass the context, and for the receiver, I'm gonna pass here chats at this particular index, and I'm gonna access the from property, which is the user with whom I am having this chat. And for me, with the user that is sending the chat, I'm gonna say widget user. And then for the chat ID, I'm gonna pass in this particular chat at index dot ID. So the chat at this particular index, and I'll get the ID for that chat. So now back to our home screen, we can now pass in the router. So widget dot router. And a similar thing for our active users, so that whenever we go ahead and select a active user, a chat will also open for that user. So let us go to our active user, and then we want to add for its dependencies to get the current user and also the router. Then for our list item, we want to add our gesture here also. So we add our list item as a child of our gesture detector. And now for the onTap method, we can go ahead and say this widget router and call the appropriate method. And for the receiver, it's gonna be the user at this current index, and then widget dot me, and for the chat ID, it's gonna be users at the current index dot ID. So now we have our gesture set up to open the message thread screen whenever we select a user from the active list of users to start a message with. So now back to our home screen, we can go ahead and pass in widget router and also underscore user, which is me, the current user. So now we have that up and running. If I should select this chat, it should open. Let me go ahead and restart. Now it should open the message thread screen, which, let me close message thread, which is an empty container. So I'm just gonna go ahead and return a scaffold here. Now we should be looking at our screen. So for our message thread state, we want to go ahead and set up a few properties that we will be using. So here we want a scroll controller, which we'll be using to manage the scrolling for a list of messages. We want a text editing controller to manage our field that we'll be typing our messages into. We will hold a reference to our chat ID, also a reference to the user that we are currently sending message to, and a reference to the subscription that we will have when we subscribe to receive messages. And here we have the list of messages, which we will initialize to 0. And we have 2 timers, which we'll use to determine if the user is typing or not, so that we can send the appropriate typing indicator. So I just want to go ahead now and inside of our init state to initialize and set up those hooks or subscription that we will use. So here we have our subscriptions that we are setting up. In this case, we are subscribing to the receipt block to receive message receipts, and we are also subscribing to the notification, the typing notification event to receive those notifications, the typing notification block. Also, I want to create 2 methods here that will write the record to the database whenever we receive those messages from our subscription. So I'm just going to call the first method on update on message received, and also update on receipt received. So let's go ahead and create those methods. So for our update on message received, I want to go ahead and hold a reference to our message thread qubit, and then I want to fetch those messages from the database if the chat ID is not empty, and then I want to go ahead and listen to the message block stream for current messages coming in and write those messages to the database. So here we set up our subscription to the message block, and we're listening on the stream to receive the states as they're passed through. And then we want to check if it's a message received success. If that's the case, then we call the appropriate method on the view model to write that message to the database. And immediately after writing that message to the database, we want to create a receipt since we have received that message and with a status of message read, and then we'll use the receipt block to write that receipt event so that we can send that event back to the user that has just sent us that message. Also, we have a message sent success. In this case, whenever we send a message, we also want to write that message to our local database. And then we want to check also when we are setting up our listener, we want to check if the chat ID here that we are holding reference to, the global chat ID here, that if that chat ID is empty, then we want to retrieve the chat ID from the view model. And in this case, we need to add a reference to that chat ID inside the chat view model. So we need to go inside the chat view model, and then we can add a reference to say string. Let's say it's a getter, and we simply return that chat ID. But also, whenever we receive a message, I want to say that if the chat ID inside our view model here, the private chat ID, if that is empty, if that's not yet set, then I'm gonna set it to local message dot chat ID. So now we have a reference to the chat ID here. And now we have configured our subscription to receive those messages and to write them to our local SQLite database. And we're going to do a similar thing for our update on receipt method. So here inside of our update on receipt received method, again we grab a reference to our message thread qubit, and we go ahead and begin listening to the receipt block stream for those receipts that are passing through. So whenever we receive a state that is receipt received success, we can go ahead and update the message with the receipt in our local database and then fetch the new messages again so that the appropriate receipt indicator can be rendered. And we also want to update the chats on the previous screen so that the amount or the number of unread messages will be updated also. But as you can see here, we need to add this method, update message receipt, to our view model. So if we go to our view model here, we need to go ahead and add that method. So our update message receipt method is quite simple. We accept a receipt and then we use a data source and call the update message receipt method, passing in the message ID and the receipt status. So we are basically updating the receipt status on this particular message. And that's it for these two methods that we have configured inside of our init state. Also, we can just go ahead here and override the dispose method to remove some of those subscriptions and the timer events. So there we go. We're gonna dispose our text control, our subscription there. We're gonna cancel both timers, and then we call our super disposed. So now for our UI, just go ahead and build out our UI. So let us go ahead and add our app bar. And for our app bar, we want to set the title spacing to 0. We want to set automatically imply leading to false. And for our title widget, I'm going to make that into a row. And for its children, I want the icon button. So let's create our icon here. Then our icon color is dependent on the theme. So if it is light theme, then the icon color should be colors black. Otherwise, colors white. So there we have our icon, and then after our icon button, I'm going to use the expanded widget to fill the remaining space. And for its child, I want the header. But since the header is the same as the home screen, I am going to create a widget called header status that I can pass certain values in. So I can reuse this. So I'm gonna pass in the username. I'm gonna pass in the photo URL. I'm gonna pass in the active status. I'm gonna pass in last seen, but I'm gonna make this optional. And also I am going to make optional another variable that determines if the user is typing or not, so that we can show that typing indicator. Now this header status is not present at the moment, so we'll have to go ahead and create that inside of our widgets. Go ahead, create a folder. Inside of the shared folder, I'll create that header status widget. So I'm gonna make this a stateless widget. Then I can add those dependencies and also go ahead and create our build method. So for this build method, I am basically gonna copy what's already inside of our home UI. If we should go to our scaffold, where we have our app bar here, which is this row, this container for the title, I am basically gonna copy all of this and this will become my header. With a few tweaks. So let's go ahead, add those tweaks here. We're going to use the image URL here. We use the online property. Then for our text, we have the username. And then for text or online text here, I'm going to make this conditional so that it renders the appropriate text based on the typing event and also whether the user is online or not. So here what we're doing is we're checking if typing is null, then we can go ahead and render the text online. And again, we're checking if online is true, then we render the text online. Otherwise, render last seen with the date, formatting the last seen date that is passed in. So otherwise, if typing is not null, we go ahead and show the text that says the user is typing, and we show it with the font style italic. So now if we should go to our home and call our header status here, Then we can pass in our username, username, user, photo URL, and I'm gonna just set online to be true. So now back to our message thread, we can go ahead, get that here, and I'm just gonna set typing to be false for now. Let's refresh. Go ahead and click remove typing. That should be online. So as you can see, we have our user showing up here and also the online indicator. But let's go back to our header status, set the cross-axis alignment on our column here, cross-axis, set that to start so that everything will be aligned. Let's go ahead and put this to 12. There we go. Now back to our message thread. Now we have our app bar. We can go ahead and create our body. So now I am going to set the resize to avoid bottom inset to true, so that the keyboard, whenever the keyboard pops up, the field that the user types in will remain on top of the keyboard. And for the body, I'm gonna use a gesture detector here as the parent, and I'm gonna set the on-tap method to to have a focus scope, so that I'm gonna request focus so that when the keyboard comes up, the user can tap away anywhere on the screen so that the keyboard will close. So now for the child of my gesture detector, I'm just gonna make a column, and for this column, for the children, I'm gonna make a flexible widget here, and this flexible widget I want a flex of 6, so it's gonna take up majority of a screen. And for the child, I'm just gonna put a container for now, since here will represent the list view that we will use to have our list of messages or the conversation that is happening. For the next child, this is where I am going to set up now our text field so that we can write our messages. But I want to be expanded so that it consumes the remaining part of the screen. And for its child, I'm gonna set up a container. This container, I want to have a height of 100 pixels, and also I'm gonna give it a decoration to add some shadows. So here is my box decoration to add some shadows. And based on the theme, I want the color of the container to be white if it's light theme, or to be the app bar dark if it is dark theme. So now I want it also to be aligned to the top center. So for its child, let's go ahead and I'm gonna create a row with the main axis alignment set to center and the cross axis alignment set to center. And then for its children, I'm gonna first create a expanded widget so that this will take up as much space as possible. And for its child, I'm gonna create a method build message input. Here I'll pass into this method the context. So this method is responsible for building out the input. So let's go ahead, build message input. And now we're going to build out or style the text field that the user will type in. So I'm just going to create a reference to an outline border here. So as you can see, the border with the radius being circular, and also the border side, the base is colored based on the theme. So if it is light theme, there is no border. Otherwise, I give it a gray with an opacity of 3. So now I'm just gonna return a text form field that I am going to style. So here I have styled my text form field. First I add the text editing controller to it, then I give the input to be new line so that we can keep adding new lines as we type. I want it to be a multi-line keyboard for the keyboard type, max lines being null. And then I style the text based on the caption from the text theme, setting the primary cursor color to our primary color. And then for the decoration, I am setting the content padding, and I'm setting the border to the border that we created here, setting the fill color to be true, and then based on the theme, I have a different fill color. So in this case, the light theme will have the primary color with an opacity of 1. I also want to wrap this inside of a focus widget so that I can have access to the onFocus change method, since I'll be using this later to determine if focus has been removed from the text field, so that we can tell if we should send typing events or cancel typing events. So now that we have our text field showing here, the next child inside of our row will be our button to send the message. So I'm just gonna create a container and I'm gonna give it a height and a width of 45 pixels. Then for its child, I'm gonna give it a raw material button. Then I'm gonna style this material button. So there I have styled the material button by giving it a fill color, giving it the shape to be a circular border, give it an elevation of 5, and I have also added the send icon here. Next thing, I'm just gonna add a padding to this container. Let's go ahead, add a padding there, but I want only with the left padding. I want that to be 12 pixels. I'm also gonna add a padding around the row. And then again, this is gonna be only, and I'm gonna add numbers for each dimension. So therefore padding, I want the left to be 20 pixels, the top to be 12, right 20, and the bottom 12. And there we have it. Instead of listing all this like that, we could go ahead and instead of saying only, we could use symmetrical, and then we could say horizontal. That would be 20, and then the vertical would be 12.0. That would be the same thing. So there we have our message text field ready. And if I should toggle the soft keyboard, you can see that my text field adjusts with the keyboard and is ready to receive whatever messages that I'm typing. And if I should be able to click away and the keyboard disappears. That's the purpose of the gesture detector here inside of our. So let us try and restart and see what happens. So let us try again. Toggle our keyboard, enter, click away, toggle our keyboard. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll continue to build out our message thread screen by creating the actual messages bubble and link those to our subscriptions so that we can receive messages. So thank you guys for tuning into this video, and see you in the next